It's great to see you. Glad you're here. If you're watching online, we're glad that you're watching. I want to wish everybody Merry Christmas. If you have your Bible with you, I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. Like you, there are a lot of things that are normally associated with this time of year that I really look forward to. But if you're like me and you have young children at home, you know there's one thing more than anything else that they tend to look forward to, and that's seeing Santa Claus and giving him their list of everything that they're hoping to get that Christmas. What complicates the process is we all understand that Santa can't be everywhere at once, especially during the month of December. And so what you have in these malls and department stores are these different people who dress up as Santa, and they collect information for Santa, and then they send that information to the North Pole. The problem is that not everybody who dresses up as Santa represents Santa in a positive manner. I read a story of last December of a large mall over in Europe in which two guys who earned a little extra money at Christmas dressing up as Santa and talking to kids both showed up to work at the mall at the same time. The manager had made a mistake on the schedule, and they were both there. And rather than working it out as gentlemen, rather than acting as adults, they proceeded to get in a very heated argument, and it wasn't long until the fists started to fly. And here's a picture of this fight that broke out between two guys dressed as Santa in the food court of a crowded mall. What you can't see is behind the camera, there were hundreds of little kids with their parents watching this fight. And if you go home and you Google this, you can find the video. You can hear a little girl in the sweetest voice asking her mother, "Mom, are they drunk?" Which is a great question for this time of year if you're talking about Santa Claus at the mall. As soon as this fight started, there was a mother who emerged from the crowd, did her best to break up these two guys. There was another mother who was interviewed later by the police, and she said that just before the fight started, she heard one of the men dressed as Santa scream at the top of his lungs, "This is my territory." To which the other one replied, "Over my dead body." And that's when the fight started. After the police got there, both the men had busted lips. Both of them were bruised up pretty good, and they tried their best to convince the police sergeant that they weren't really mad at each other, they were only joking, but nobody believed that. The policeman described it to the local newspaper as a mafia-style territorial dispute. Now, I don't know what gets you excited for Christmas, but to me, there's nothing that says Christmas spirit, like two men dressed as Santa trying to fight each other in a food court over a few extra dollars. Matthew chapter 2, what you find is somebody who should have known better, who seems to miss the Christmas story altogether, seems to miss the true spirit of Christmas. His name is Herod. He goes by Herod the Great, which was a title that he seems to have given himself, and historians tell us that he was a vindictive and ruthless leader from every angle. For Herod, his entire life revolved around amassing and holding on to power no matter what it cost him. He ruled the area that we know as Judea, which is where Jerusalem is located, for 40 years, which really troubled the Jews because he was not Jewish, and from their perspective, he had no right to the throne. He'd started out serving as a sort of a regional governor in that area under the authority of the Roman Empire, but then after a few years of that, he sort of wanted a promotion. So he made a power play, and he lobbied the empire, and the emperor at that time, a guy named Augustus Caesar, gave him the title King of Judea. Now, to be clear, he was really still just a governor, but he had the title, and it fed into his ego. And as his ego continued to expand, his paranoia also continued to grow. When he first came to power, one of the first things he did is he had executed 68 of the 70 members of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which was kind of like their Supreme Court and the Congress, all rolled up into one. And he saw those folks as a threat to his power, so he had them eliminated on his first day in office. From there, it just continued. He killed his wife. He killed his mother-in-law. He killed most of his sons. He killed most of his uncles. He killed all of his cousins. For Herod, anybody that was possibly seen as a threat or maybe could be a threat in the future to his authority was systematically eliminated. He was, in every sense of the word, a dictator whose number one priority was hanging on to power no matter what it cost him or the people who lived under him. Now, with that as background, you kind of understand when you get to Matthew chapter 2, the story starts to make a a little more sense. It's a story that most of you probably heard before. If you're a person who decorates your house at Christmas, very likely that you have some sort of depiction of what we're getting ready to read in your house somewhere. I want you to read this with me. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Now let me stop just a second and talk about the Magi, the wise men you might be familiar with. To be honest, there's a lot of misinformation about these guys. In fact, most of what we think we know, it turns out to be wrong. For example, there is a popular song that we sometimes hear this time of year titled, "We Three Kings." The problem is that almost everything in that song turns out to be incorrect. For example, these guys were not kings. We don't know if there were three of them. In fact, we don't know how many there were, probably more. And they didn't come from the Orient, or at least what we tend to think of when we think of the Orient. Most scholars believe they came from somewhere in Persia, which would be, modern-day Iraq. The other thing that can be misleading is because they're called Magi, we tend to think of them as magicians, but that's not true either. What they were is these high-ranking sort of political and religious advisors. You might think of them as policy advisors to the folks in charge. These were high-level scholars who interpreted world events and tried to make sense of changes in leadership. So you might think of these guys as diplomats or diplomatic scholars who used insights that they learned from all these different areas, including astrology, medicine, and even political science to make sense and interpret world events. These were the kind of guys that if they showed up at your doorstep and started asking questions, you would instinctively know that something big was happening. These are the kind of guys, if you saw them roll into town, you would immediately know that something is up. That's why when you get to verse 3, Matthew tells us that when the Magi showed up, Herod was disturbed. He knew enough about them to recognize that if these guys are here, something big is happening. And you have to remember, for Herod, his number one priority is staying on the throne. His number one priority is the self-preservation of his own power. I mean, he was so obsessed with it, he literally killed off most of his own family. And now as he's growing old and his grasp on power is slowly starting to give way, out of nowhere, he's confronted with these impressive guys who show up and they start asking questions about another king that's just been born. It's hard for us to imagine something that would have been more disturbing for a guy like Herod than the arrival of a new king. That's why Matthew says not only was Herod disturbed, but all Jerusalem was disturbed with him. Because they knew when Herod gets upset, what happens? People start to die. And they had no idea how far Herod was going to go to protect his throne, and so everybody was on edge. Now check out verse 4. It says, when he called together all the people's chief priests and the teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report back to me so that I too may go and worship him. Now, at this point, even though he's old, even though he's paranoid, Herod's still pretty crafty, and he's trying to manipulate the Magi into giving away this new king's position. As I said, these guys are major players. They're not naive. They see through Herod's trick, and they go and they find the child on their own. Now, skip down to verse 9. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Now, if you know the rest of the story, You know, at this point, the story takes a really dark turn. Once Herod realizes that he's been outsmarted by the Magi, rather than coming up with sort of an alternative plan, he chooses the nuclear option. And he gives an order that to our modern ears sounds sort of strange, but when it was compared to other things that Herod did during his time in power, it's just one more drop in the ocean of injustice and violence that he directed. Skip down to verse 16. When Herod realized that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled, of voices heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Now the reason that Herod ordered the murder of every little boy in Bethlehem is that by the time the Magi actually arrived, Jesus was no longer a baby. He was a toddler, anywhere from 18 to 24 months. The word that Matthew uses in verse 10, the Greek word, does not mean baby. It means small child. So if you go home today and you've got a nativity scene set up and the wise men are there, you need to move them, just to be more accurate. Put the nativity scene on one end of the house, put the wise men on the other, because it was a couple of years later before they arrived. But it's estimated that because of the population of Bethlehem during the first century, that Herod's soldiers probably killed between 20 and 30 little boys on that one day. Now for me, it's hard to imagine the loss of a child. But to lose your child violently because of the insecurity of a cruel leader seems hard to imagine. I spent a lot of time thinking about this story over the last couple weeks. I started to write down some themes that you see. As I did that, it was amazing how many of these dark themes seemed to bubble up to the surface in just this one narrative. Just think about this. This one story, you've got deception and fear, bloodshed, senseless violence, oppression, infanticide, injustice, homelessness, political corruption, the powerful attempting to manipulate the powerless, unchecked ambition, unrestrained anger, and even blind rage. I mean, this is a story that very easily could have been written in 2020. This is a story, you look at all the themes that sort of converge here to come together, and you see that it forms the backdrop of most of what we see in our day-to-day life when we get online and we watch the news. To me, this part of the Christmas story is just one more clear reminder that we live in a world that is sometimes really dark. Now, it's not all the time dark, and sometimes it's really good. I mean, you look around, all of us here, all of you watching online, all of us have been more blessed than we deserve, and we've been given things that we in no way deserve. And yet, when you look around, there's still a lot of darkness. And sometimes the darkness that sort of surrounds us out there can get in here if we're not careful. And it can start to weigh us down. Some of you are dealing with it right now. Medical conditions, family dysfunction, broken hearts, unfulfilled dreams, intense grief, financial pressure, injustice, oppression, infanticide, violence, corruption, addiction, abuse. I mean, it's all out there. You can see it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And sometimes it gets pretty dark, and it can get pretty heavy. So the question is, how do you learn to live as light in a world that sometimes feels so dark? Last couple of weeks, we talked about this contrast between the light and the darkness. Over in Ephesians 5, the Apostle Paul wrote these words. He said, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord." Then he gives this command. He said, "Live as children of light." How do you live as a child of light in a world that sometimes feels so dark? You look at this story, Matthew chapter 2, it's obvious that Herod was a representative of the darkness. He was a guy who represents everything the darkness represents. But thankfully, he's not the only guy mentioned in the story. You look at the example of the Magi or the wise men, and you see them do 3 specific things that enable them to spread a little light in a world of darkness, and they serve as a good model for us. Here's the first thing. You want to live as a child of light, if you're keeping track, it requires focused worship. Go back to verse 11 with me for a minute. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Did anybody see the news this week about the what astrologers are calling the Christmas star? There's a picture of it. This is what NASA says it may look like tomorrow night. The two largest planets in our solar system, Jupiter and Saturn, are going to appear closer together than they have in 800 and some years. The scientists at NASA says it'll look like a double planet, which will make it extraordinarily bright. They call it a conjunction. And this will be the first time that this has happened since March the 4th, 1226. Couldn't even say it. 1226. So it's been almost 800 years since this happened. And as cool as that is, I hope you get out tomorrow. I hope you can see it. I hope the clouds clear up enough for us to see that. As cool as that is, though, what makes this even more interesting, I got to reading about this week. Make sure you catch this. According to NASA, the same thing happened 3 times during the months of May, October, and December during the year 6 BC, which is the year that most scholars think Jesus was born, because our calendars are a little bit off. Now, if that's true, it's not that big of a stretch to imagine that God could have somehow used something like that to serve as a GPS to guide the Magi to exactly the place that he wanted them to be. So when you go out tomorrow night, if you see that, you might just for the smallest moment experience just a little bit of what they experienced. But as cool as that is, what interests me most about this story is not how they got there, but it's what they did once they arrived. Matthew says they saw Jesus, they saw Mary, and they immediately bowed down and worshiped him. Now, if you're like me, you hear that word worship, you immediately think music, you immediately think singing. If I were to say, hey, we're going to have a time of worship after I get done, you would immediately think, okay, we're going to sing some songs. And that's not wrong, but when the New Testament uses the word worship, it's describing something that goes a lot deeper than just, singing the words to a few familiar songs. The Greek word means to recognize that you're in the presence of someone that you should be in awe of. And usually it indicates that you're going to kiss their hand or kneel before them as a means of showing your respect to that person. Now you read this story, and it's clear that Herod wasn't going to bow down to anybody. I mean, he's not going to worship anybody but himself. But you contrast that with the attitude of the Magi. I mean, here are these important guys, these important scholars, these government advisors, and what do? They bow before a 2-year-old little boy in an out-of-the-way place. And as they do that, they recognize that there is something incredible about the little boy that stands before him. See, one of the things that can happen during the Christmas season, we're all guilty of this, is that we can get so distracted by all the events of Christmas that we miss the event of Christmas. Now, I've done that, and you've done that too. I mean, the parties and the gifts and the music and the movies and all that sort of come together this time of year. And if you're not really careful, you can wake up on December 26th and you can realize that you went all through the Christmas season without ever really pausing to think about what it all means. Last weekend, we talked about the fact there are now two different Christmases that both get celebrated at the same time. One's completely secular, the other is focused on the birth of Jesus. And the problem is, you can go through one of them without going through both of them. You can rush through one without ever thinking about the real meaning behind all this. That's why you have to be intentional in finding ways to focus yourself and focus your family on the event of Christmas and not get distracted by all the periphery events. So if you're like me and you got young kids, sometime this next week, when you're watching, Home Alone and The Grinch and all that stuff, take a moment and just pull out your Bible and read Luke chapter 2. When you get up on Christmas morning, instead of opening up the presents and ripping through those immediately, somebody download, a brief devotional that talks about, God's greatest gift. And it might feel awkward at first, but I promise you when you look back on it, it will make it more meaningful. On Christmas Eve, before you have your family meal, before you do whatever it is your family does on Christmas Eve, you come to Christmas Eve service. You can live stream it if you're not going to come. And just get your family together and for 30, 40 minutes, really focus on what it means. If you're a person who listens to a lot of music, instead of listening to Elvis tell you to have a blue Christmas and Sinatra tell you to have a Merry Christmas and Michael Bublé telling you how cold it is outside over and over again. Hit the pause button, download a track from Spotify or Pandora. Just listen to some, just the Christmas carols that actually tell the story of the real Christmas. And the point is, if you'll do just a few of those things, just very intentionally over the next few days, doesn't have to be weird, but you do a few of those things together, and all of a sudden you get to the end of it and you'll realize that you really focused on the real story. Here's a second thing it requires is sacrificial generosity. We'll check out the last part of verse 11. It says, "Then they opened their treasures, and they presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh." Now, it's important to understand these were very expensive gifts that the Magi presented to Jesus. They were also very symbolic gifts. For example, gold was a gift that was normally reserved for a king. So by giving this little boy this gold, they're acknowledging that he is a king. They're acknowledging his royalty. Incense, or what your translation might call frankincense, is this material that releases this fragrant smoke whenever it's burned. And in the Old Testament times, the priests would pour the incense on the altar, then they would light it on fire, and the fragrant smoke would go to the ceiling. It was a symbol of their prayers rising up to God. And so by giving him this frankincense is an acknowledgement from this Magi that not only is he a king, but he's also a priest. The last gift that Matthew mentions is something called myrrh. Now, it's this little resin that's used to make perfume that would sweeten the air. And in the first century, it was used to help embalm dead bodies. Now, I know that sounds weird. I mean, I've gotten a lot of weird gifts. You can imagine over my life. You probably have too. But if you went home and somebody handed you a gift, said, "I want you to unwrap this," and it was a thing of embalming fluid, you'd be pretty creeped out, right? I mean, you wouldn't want that. You'd probably re-gift that to somebody you didn't like. But what these guys do is by doing that, they're acknowledging that somehow they know that Jesus is going to die an early death. So you take these symbolic gifts, these expensive gifts, you put them all together, and they tell the story of Jesus' life. But there's something else here that I want you to catch that we sometimes miss when we read this story. You get down to verse 13, and Matthew tells us that this angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, and he warned him that Herod was looking to kill Jesus. And so to protect his family, he tells Joseph, "Hey, pack up everything you've got and move to Egypt while things cool off here." The problem with that is if you ever move, especially if you've moved to another country, you know it's really expensive. And Joseph and Mary, one of the things the Bible tells us is they were very poor. It's not like they had access to some huge account somewhere with all this extra money laying around. But what they do have now is access to some gold and some spices that are worth thousands of dollars. And so when you start to put the story together, a lot of scholars believe that Joseph and Mary probably used at least some of the proceeds from these gifts to finance their stay in Egypt. And the point is that as all of this was taking place, the Magi had no idea how this was going to work out. Mary and Joseph had no idea how this was going to work out. But as all this is happening, God is working behind the scenes to use the generosity of a few key individuals to accomplish something that they didn't even know they were contributing to. He's using their gifts to accomplish his mission. And the cool thing is, works the same way today. God uses our gifts in ways that we can't even wrap our minds around. And he uses them to advance his kingdom. You heard us talk about this. Some of you got a letter. Today's our annual Christmas offering. We don't make a huge deal out of that. One of the things I'm thankful for is throughout the year, we got so many people who give generously that enable us to do a lot of cool things without having to take up a special offering every time we see an opportunity. But as Christmas comes around, we take up this offering to give us a specific boost in areas that we think are important. So as we explained in the letter, this year, whatever's given, 50% of that will go towards making another payment on our promise, on the promise campaign, the debt from the buildings and the land and all that. We've been able, luckily, this year to make a couple extra payments. We'd love to make another one, and we think we can do that this year. 25% of it will go to support one of our longtime mission partners, Clinton Looney, down in Mexico. I asked one of our elders, how many years has Mr. Looney been in Mexico? They told me over 100. I don't think that was accurate, but I do think he's been there a long time. 50 years, no joke. Started hundreds of churches, And as he gets ready to embark in a new year, we want to give him a little extra boost. And then the last 25% will help us seize opportunities right here in our own community. You know, a lot of things happen in our community. People come to us, they say, hey, will you partner with us on this? And we can't do everything, but every once in a while we like to partner with other people to do some cool things, and this money will be used for that. So with all that in mind, here's my question to you. And I'm going to ask you the same way I asked the folks in the first service. Will you help us do that? I'm serious about that. I mean, I don't know what you should give, and I don't know what you can give, but I know that everybody should give something. And you can write a check. I've got mine right here. There's an envelope out there. I'm not going to ask you to do something that I'm not going to do. So you can write a check. You can give cash. There's a dip jar out there if you want to use your card. The text to give number will be up here later. You can give online. I mean, there's no limit, and I don't know how you should give, and I wouldn't dream of telling you what you should give, but I do know that everybody should give, because when you give of your resources to God, he does stuff that we don't even realize he's doing to accomplish his mission. And the only way we get to participate in that is if we give. Now, here's the last thing. You want to help live as light, you want to help spread the light, you have to make it a point to use encouraging words. One of the questions that never gets answered in this story that I thought a lot about this week is, what do you think Mary's reaction was to all this? Here she is, she's 14 or 15 years old. She's been, all of her friends, all of her family thought she was nuts. Everybody questioned her. She'd been forced to pack up and go to a strange place. Now she's got to pack up and move not only to a strange place, but to a different country. And here she was excited about having this boy, but now he's been born and he's 18 months, 2 years into this, and it's just been one long struggle. I mean, she had to have been disillusioned. She might have been a little bit discouraged. And when you're discouraged, there is nothing like an encouraging word to give you a boost. Proverbs 12, Solomon says it like this: anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word cheers it up. You know, right now, we're living in a time in which there are more people discouraged, and probably more deeply discouraged than in any other time in our lifetimes. I mean, you look around, almost everybody you talk to is fighting some kind of battle, man, that they never saw coming. And I'm talking to people, I mean, every week. There are some people who are in the midst of such intense grief that it's hard for them to even breathe. There are families that are coming apart at the seams, man. They are in such intense family fights that it feels like an explosion is getting ready to happen. You get to the end of this year, you start to look at another year, and there's some people, man, they look off in the future, and all they see is so much uncertainty that they don't know the next step to take, much less which direction to take it in. And here's the deal. One of the gifts that all of us can give that won't cost us barely anything, may not cost us anything, and will mean more to the people around us than anything they unwrap on Christmas morning, is the gift of encouragement. Over in Luke 2, Luke tells us that as Mary was hearing all these things about her son, it says she pondered these things and she treasured them in her heart. And there's something about even the smallest fragment of encouragement that can be like a lifeline to somebody who feels like they're drowning. And here's the thing, the lifeline is something that all of us can give that won't even cost us anything, man. A handwritten note, an encouraging text, a voicemail, a letter, even a gift card, if you want to take it that far. I mean, this time of year, all those things can mean so much to a person who feels like the darkness is closing in on them. And for a lot of those people, it can be the difference between light and darkness. But there's a challenge in all of this, and some of you already know what it is. The problem is there's a little bit of King Herod in all of us. The cold hard truth is that most of us are a lot more like those two Santas rolling around on the ground, acting like clowns, fighting over a few extra dollars and a little bit of control than we care to admit. I want you to listen to these words from Tim Keller. He said, each of us wants the world to orbit around us and our needs and our desires. We don't want to serve God or our neighbor. We want them to serve us. In every little heart, then, there is a little King Herod that wants to rule and is threatened by anything that may compromise its omnipotence and sovereignty. Each of us wants to be captain of our own soul, the master of our own fate. And so, rather than following the example of the Magi and humbly bowing our knee in recognition of who God is, most of us prefer to stand and fight and resist. But then you come to the end of the year, and it's an annual reminder that in the most unexpected of places, at the most unexpected of times, there was a king that was born, and that king is not you, and it's not me. And because that's true, each of us has a decision to make. We can choose to try and hold on to the power. We can try to stay on the throne no matter what it costs, and we can perpetuate the darkness around us and just sort of add to it. Or we can follow the example of these mysterious first century Magi, and we can bow our knee to the King and become children of light. I want you to stand. We're going to have just a brief invitation. If you're here and you've never stepped into the light, we'd love to help you do that. No better day than today, no better time than now. And if you need help figuring this out, David and I will be here. You just come and talk to us on this front row. You can grab us after church is over, whatever you're comfortable with. But we just want you to know that there is nothing you can do that would make this Christmas more meaningful than humbly acknowledging who the true King is.